Welcome to this episode of the Ascension Alchemy podcast. My name is Michael Abramson, and I am delighted to be here this week as I speak on behalf of the conscious evolved man and the journey that many of us are navigating through these very transformative times. I smile because I feel this week many of us have been really hit with a lot of density and heaviness in these external events, especially with the recent death of Charlie Kirk. And so it's made me go really deep inside to put the question out there and how to respond or react to extreme negative situations. For growing up and really seeing my father react so extreme from such levels of rage and anger when there was chaos or when there was a threat, it really didn't give me a proper way of understanding or an ability to choose how I was going to respond in a conscious way. And I feel many of us are going through this because all we have to do is turn on social media or look at the news and just see the overreaction that creates quite hysteria. And what I see, just an amount of energy that can be very overwhelming. So in this episode, I invite the question, and really to look deep within, is as we move through life and when we're shocked or in our own relationships, or we're at our job, or something happens that are out of control, what tendencies usually happen within? Because I feel all of us are really just confused at this time of how so many really don't have a control over their emotions or thoughts. I'm speaking to myself as well, because emotional mastery and how we let our thoughts move through us is definitely an evolved consciousness that takes quite a bit of time and practice. And I see working with lots of men, especially in my men's circle, we dive deep into these conversations because many of us really never had great role models of how we choose to respond or react. Or many of us weren't taught how to express our emotions. Or if something bad happened, usually we got to see the extreme angry portion, but we didn't see the response from a conscious way. And that is what I'm here to speak of today, because I feel as we go through what we're seeing in the outer environment, it's a true testament, I feel, within to see what we're going to do in our inner environment. As we know, we're the creators of our reality, and so within, so without. And many times I feel that reflection outside of us gives us the opportunity to go within to say, how am I going to choose this situation before me? Am I going to let my emotions take over me and allow all my unhealed pains, triggers, come spewing out in ways that are just unsolicited, maybe a bit extreme, and sometimes just downright ugly? Versus, can I just take a pause for a moment and feel what's happening in my body and really choose to respond, because I know it's my responsibility to act in a way where it feels it's happening in a balanced and conscious way. I say this because as many men are evolving, I believe communication is our greatest access in this world at our time, because the root of many conflicts becomes where we're not communicating ourselves in a proper way. And what I mean by a proper way is a way that we come out clear, a way that people can understand us, in a way that comes out in a authentic way, in a real way. And I find growing up as a man, one of the main reasons why our reactions have been quite challenging for many to hear, especially those on the other side of our tantrums, of our fights, is because many of us men, I believe, really never took accountability for what we've expressed or what we said. Just last night I was having a deep conversation with a dear friend from high school. And we were talking about, as we grew up, if we said something, if we overreacted, many times we would kind of slide that under the carpet. And we really didn't understand that our words, our actions actually have an opposite, an equal reaction to those that receive them. And many times we were never accountable for them. We never took the responsibility to say, wow, these words hurt. These actions actually have an impact. And yet, when we look at society now, I feel there's been some sort of regressing in which we're not really thinking how we react unless we step back and really draw awareness of what's being communicated before in each moment. And a lot of this, I feel, starts within our own relationship with ourselves. I know growing up, I held back a lot of how I chose to react because I wanted to avoid conflict. There was this people pleasing, and I felt like if I reacted in a wrong way, I would be judged. So what happened? I overjudged myself, and I chose to stay more quiet and shy in the beginning until I understood underneath that was just the held back energy of massive rage and anger that I learned from my father because I didn't want to say something that was wrong or I'd be screamed, yelled, or punished. So there's deep levels to this question of how I choose to respond or react, because both are neither right nor wrong. When we look at reaction, there's a time to react. If the house is on fire and we got to react as quick as possible by grabbing our important belongings, grabbing our loved ones, our pets and animals, we have to react so quickly there is not a time to think. So emergencies, reaction, it has to be vital, on point, and on instinct. Yet, if we're reacting in a time where it's not an emergency, but we're coming from a place of our pain and we're projecting that onto people, that's a whole different story. And then, of course, there's responding, which I look deep within. There's a moment where we can respond, and if it's too quickly, we may not actually have heard the person, or we may not have paused just to listen what he or she was saying. Ask my wife. Many times I respond so quickly, she asked me, did you hear what I said? And so maybe responding too quickly tends to be an action where we can just step back and pause. So that response can be at a moment where we actually digest and hear what the other person said. So it really varies with each situation. But to go back to the initial question and to ask our audience if to respond or react in an extreme situation. And when I say extreme situation, I look at this past week, and I feel it's touched us all because in tragedy, it brings up all of our emotions. It brings up every single feeling that we can imagine when it comes to death. And what is really important to understand is when we respond or react, it's coming from an internal place. And what I've noticed this week, and what I specifically noticed within myself, is if there's any unhealed pain, any trauma or hurt that hasn't been fully expressed, that reaction or response is first going to go through that level of energy. And what's so important to understand, that I'm learning deeper and deeper as it's a daily journey that I like to share with you, and of those that can understand it within themselves, is it's like a filter. And if you can imagine, like any filter, if there is heavy density, if there's pain, if there's trauma, there's a lot of wounds, there's a lot of sharp, pointy thorns that when energy is being brought through, it can attach itself in ways where it may not come out so crystal clear, so nice and so light. And so I'm saying this because when we're going through pain, when we're going through hurt and it still hasn't been unhealed, a lot of times we're speaking from that level, which we don't even realize because it's unconscious. And for me, as a conscious evolved man that works with a lot of men in this conscious journey, it's so important to bring awareness to those unhealed areas and how we choose to communicate. And one of the areas that I find is a solution that I've felt within me is to really communicate from the heart versus the mind, and to respond in a way that the heart is expressing its feeling versus sometimes the reaction of the unhealed emotion that is still stuck through a limitation that comes through the mind. The mind is such an interesting area for many of us men because our mental faculty is one of the most masculine areas in our body. And I see when we communicate from this, what I call head energy, it's interesting to see how sometimes it's communicated without feeling, without our heart actually expressing the authenticity, because as we communicate through the head, we're also communicating through the ego. And again, the ego is not right or wrong, good or bad, but the ego is our identity. It's our belief system. And once again, it's what holds us in a safe and comfortable position with our trauma. And so as we respond or react, our ego has direct relationship, because what does the ego want to do? It wants to control us and how it chooses to respond or react. So these are areas I'd like to bring out and ask you, as I respond, as I react, what place is it coming from? Is it coming from my heart? Is it coming from my head? Is it coming from a traumatic response? Because I know, living in this Washington, D.C. metro area where it couldn't be more political, in which myself and Honey are in the straight line of neutrality, neither political, neutral, standing in unity consciousness, it becomes quite an interesting observation to see how many are reacting in such an extreme way, in a way that it almost skips over the normality of being a human, and sometimes coming from such an unethical and immoral place that I'm neither judging nor criticizing, just drawing awareness, as almost like we've regressed back in our communication of what I believe speaking from the innocence. You know, I was speaking with a dear client, and I told him, wow, imagine if we had a child in front of us, and what happened with Charlie Kirk this past week. How would we communicate? How would we respond or react in front of a child? Because somewhere when we bring a child into it, we actually have to hold ourselves in a level of dignity, because most people are not going to be cursing, screaming, and coming out in a profound nature in front of a child, because when we see children, we actually have this natural reaction or natural response of giving respect. So maybe we can ask ourselves, when we choose to respond and react, can we choose to imagine there's a child in front of us because we are actually the role model? We're actually one that this child's looking up to us. And it can maybe give a solution to say, as I see something extreme in my life, as I see something that's negative, what happens if I'm surrounded by children? How can I tailor that comes out? Because sometimes it's better just to take a breath and to respond when it's not an emergency. Again, communication is an art that all of us are learning beyond a child, beyond an adult. And conscious communication then becomes a whole new level of awareness where we have to bring forth greater levels of discipline, and I feel myself, responsibility in how my words create a reaction based on how I communicate in the volume, communicate in the tone, and most importantly, communicate from a place of whether my heart is expressing it from feeling or my mind's coming from a limited place. So they're all interesting areas to navigate when we look at responding and reacting. And like I said, I feel as we move further in the journey of the conscious evolved man, there's a place for both. Yet I feel to respond in grace, to respond in elegance, and to respond as God would do. I think of the prophets. I think of the ascended masters. I think of all those that would speak in reverence and dominion. I think of how would God speak in accordance to something this extreme. And that's what helps me move through this. I don't know how you feel about this, because it's like when we bring in a higher aspect of ourselves into this question, I feel like all of a sudden we're letting go of the lower mind and we're inviting our higher wisdom into this question that naturally takes over and aligns with these divine principles. So how would God speak through you if we just learned about this tragedy? Would we judge? Would we criticize? Would we hold back? This has nothing to do, again, with what party you're on, who you agree, what you disagree, what the man stood up for. I'm just talking if our higher presence within us spoke through, how would that come forth? And as a man, as a conscious man, when speaking to a lot of my brothers, I invite that to see how we can act, because I feel as men, we have a great responsibility before us. And I speak to this a lot to those that are really on this journey of consciousness. Growing up, men didn't really communicate in ways that were quite, let's just say, quite conscious. It was actually quite toxic because there wasn't this amount of awareness of how impactful our words feel. Many times the conversations that happened in our houses, the conversations that happened within relationships, they really were kept internal. But now as social media is opening up, now as our awareness is bringing light to it, I feel like we're really starting to draw the refinement and, most important, the alignment of how we choose to speak and how we choose to navigate in our relationships. For me, it's so important to remain in that connection with God. And yes, there are times I lose it because I may not be so connected because I'm either tired or exhausted or not just presence. And when that happens, all of a sudden, that lower aspect of the mind takes over and I react in ways which I'm not even conscious of. But then I know when I'm in a place where I feel balanced and I feel harmonized, then I start to actually pause and choose the words I want to speak. So it's not just this overreaction. Have you ever noticed when you're speaking to someone about an extreme event, and when that communication's happening, how the tone is coming forth and what the person's feeling? And whether one is speaking from that pain or whether one's speaking from their authentic truth. And then as the listener, isn't it interesting to see how we choose to react? Are we listening to the individual, or are we already thinking of the next thing we want to respond based on what the person's saying? It's such a great topic to explore, because I feel the more we become present with ourselves and the more we start to really just be in a state of complete observation, then the response starts to happen naturally. And as that response starts to happen naturally, it's coming from a place, from a higher source. Because as we listen and as we feel and as we become authentic within ourselves, then I start to see how that radiates to the individual we're speaking to and invites that opportunity for he or she to then communicate back. We're under such interesting times that I feel our response can actually create the solution and healing based on any extreme level, because all we have to do is smile. All we have to do is sometimes look at a person without even saying anything and just nod in empathy and compassion. I see many times where the greatest power is to respond without even saying anything, but just feeling the presence of resonance that someone is going through a difficult time. Because many of us are going through such challenging moments that I ask myself, can we just take that sacred pause? And what happens when we take that sacred pause? What happens when we truly just listen before we respond or react? That to me is that 1 second, 2 second where we can just breathe. Because what I've learned in myself is it's so important to see if I'm being triggered by an extreme negative event. My first responsibility is to notice, is that trigger within me coming from an unhealed place? And when I notice that, how to respond by just breathing and recognizing my body, my central nervous system might be out of alignment. So just to take a breath and a pause to recalibrate myself before then exerting what the next word's going to say. So the next time there may be an extreme event, the next time something's happening, maybe ask yourself, how am I going to choose to move forward in this? Because when we look at responsibility, respond is our ability. And that's not to say reaction is necessary when there is a moment that action needs to be done. Yet I know in the masculinity, and I know when seeing a lot of this, let's just say heavy contraction, the norm is to react. And again, when that reaction comes, I feel the next step is to do our best not to personalize it, to not judge it. Because in a world right now that is just transmuting and alchemizing such density, I'm really understanding that it's for us just to allow each person to have their experience. What would happen? What would happen if we could just allow each person to have their own experience, whether responding or reacting? Obviously not in a negative way. If it's in a negative way, we have to create the healthy boundaries and parameters. But what would happen if we could just take for a moment and say, wow, that person's having a very challenging experience. I'm noticing that reaction is quite extreme. How can I give more love, compassion, and blessings? Or, wow, he is really taking a moment to respond in such a godlike way. I'm so inspired by that. How can I learn and grow from that? Because I usually react so quickly. Sometimes the words are ahead of my thoughts. And that's where we just really have to take that pause and look within to see how we're going to communicate. Because right now, our words, our actions, and what I feel, our ability to choose what we're going to do in a conscious way is one of the biggest steps that as a man we can give back to this community and being a role model. And so today I want to thank each and every one of you that are here, the men that know how important it is to respond in a way that it brings forth our truth of who we are versus coming from a reaction from pain that may distort that from a painful place. So next time when there is a crazy event, or next time we're on social media, we're looking at the news, I ask this: what choice are you going to make? Because I'm asking myself every day, and I reflect this on myself. What choices am I going to make? Because I feel these choices are what echoes out. And all of us are here with great choices. And all of us are here to make great decisions. So as we move through these crazy, chaotic times, maybe we can just slow down a little, take the lens of judgment off, and really look within, as I do each day, and make a healthy response. And allow what I say to the men of being the best version of yourself. Because, men, we know when we come from our greatest version, we're giving so much to the world that gives inspiration for other men to rise. And when other men start to see this ability that we can communicate from a heart-centered place, where I feel is the source of who we are, then it starts to come out in our most natural and authentic way. So once again, I'd like to thank each and every one of you that are listening. There's so much more to speak on this, as I find responding and reacting are, wow, deep levels to look within and to really see how we want to choose, because at the end of the day, it becomes a choice that we can do for the highest and greatest good of all. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our next conversation on this incredible Ascension Alchemy podcast.